Just to comment on that, Nat, why would you care about GRC? I think, there's lots of technical reasons to care, but there's the fundamental point that you're losing control. Where you had more control in an on-premise environment, over time you're losing control. And GRC attempts to give you back some of that control, the G being governance. So, you care because this is a way for you to embody what you care about and translate it to policy and
years to resolve. And so from the user or business perspective, they would say, well, ISO, you can throw around the alphabet soup. I don't really care at the end of the day. So, you do whatever you need to do to protect it. And losing control, wouldn't some businesses say, well, I'm okay with losing control. That's why I signed up for this. Sure. What I'm interested in is having the services provided in my business, and you do whatever you need to do. If you're, here at RSA, arguing about this, that's great, but I just want the services. And, when I signed on the dotted line, I'm fully aware of losing control, and I'm good with that. And
but
so I'm curious
there's nothing that stops you from using those services. The question is, if you put data into the cloud that is regulated, what do the providers have to do? If the data is not regulated, who cares?
But then isn't there but I guess on the contract level, you have sections that say, like, you will comply with all, relevant regulations, rather than going into, no. Why?
Do you know what your information is? You certainly can't expect your cloud service provider to know how meaningful your data is or is not if you don't know how meaningful your data is or is not.
Wow.
What's that in the
That's that could be a 3-hour discussion of itself. If the cloud provider doesn't know what type of data, then you get to this lowest common denominator, right, which is the cloud providers just say, I don't know what you're putting here, so I'm not going to guarantee that I'm following any regulations.
And that's exactly what Salesforce.com does, and that would have been a great question to ask Benioff this morning, because that's exactly what they say. It's your data. We don't have anything to do with it. If you violate ITAR rules or you violate, European privacy problems, that's your problem. We don't look at your data. Next question, please.
Yes, perhaps the solution is encryption. As a cloud customer, if I'm storing my data in the cloud, why not just give the customer the ability to encrypt the information? I hold on to the keys. I have the ability to decrypt the information, not the provider. The provider has no business at looking at my information. Now, that also benefits the provider, because what you're simply storing is ciphertext information. Mm-hmm. So what triggers GLBA is the storage of financial information, personal financial information. What triggers HIPAA is health information. PCI is account information. But if the provider is simply storing ciphertext data, and the provider has no means of decrypting that information, the customer has that ability, then the argument is the provider is not storing personally identifiable information. You're outside the scope of the privacy laws.
You're missing a huge portion of the equation.
Right.
Okay, if you encrypt the data at storage, that's fine. Now, if you want to actually do anything with that data, if you want to use it or process it or index it or sort it or whatever, it has to be decrypted. Right. So where do you decrypt it? And who holds the keys?
The customer would hold the keys, but not the provider. So the issue is why does the provider need to know what I'm storing?
They don't need to if all you're doing is storing it.
So that's what I want to do. I just simply want a provider that's going to store my information.
So if you want to use Amazon's S3 to store data encrypted, go right ahead. Right. Now it's up to you to encrypt the data and you hold the keys, and that's fine.
Right.
Now, if you actually want to do something with the data, if you want to use it in some fashion other than storing it, you have to decrypt it.
Right. But just simply from a storage standpoint.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
That's a beautiful picture.
Yeah. But unfortunately, from your perspective, a lot of people want to do a lot more with their data in the cloud than simple storage. There's a reason why it's called S3. That's all there is.
Right.
Yeah, so if I wanted to run some DNA sequences on EC3 Elastic Clouds, right? I got to decrypt that data out there so I can crunch it, whether it's encrypted at rest or not. Okay, great. But it's still decrypted someplace in that infrastructure. Building a Google app, right? Even if I store it all encrypted, at some point it's going to be displayed to an end user, an admin, and then you're back in the same boat again. So.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. So other questions? Again, welcome, encouraged from the audience. So obviously we're talking a lot about compliance. That's what the panel deals with. But let me come back to the fact that Are we actually adding value with all this effort that's going into compliance? Frankly, are we simply hamsters on a hamster wheel here? We're spinning around the wheel. What value are we really adding here? We obviously have a lot of skeptical questions from the audience about what seems to be the value and how well the efforts are that companies are making. How do we, in effect, sell these efforts and convince people that we are adding value?
That's like $1 million question there, buddy. I'd be up there if I knew the answer to that one. I mean, it's difficult because we deal with a lot of e-commerce customers, right? And I heard somebody at the previous talk say PCI is everything, and PCI is everything, and it's the only thing, and that becomes difficult for a lot of organizations that don't have strong security management. You know, they look at any solution and say, does it check one of the PCI boxes? No. Well, I'm not going to get budget for that, and I'm not going to do that. And it could be the most critical bit of data that you have that's floating out there that's going to get compromised tomorrow, but it doesn't have a little PCI checkbox, and you're not going to get budget for it. And then, I mean, PCI just announced they're moving to like a 2-year release cycle now. Like, really? 3? Seriously? I mean, come on. That's just ridiculous. Like, but they're in a difficult position because they're dealing with merchants anywhere from the single guy with a Square card to you know, multinationals. And but there's no way a 3-year cycle on a compliance piece is going to anywhere take place, keep pace with what's going on out there. And you know, how many people have been compromised that are PCI compliant, right? So every time they go back in, oh, they weren't PCI compliant. Well, they just had an audit like last week. Like, did something change or what? So it's difficult, and I think the security folks have a hard time with it because most of them know what to do to make them secure, but they don't have executive buy-in because it's not regulated by something, and that's just, we're going to keep spinning like hamster wheels until that happens.
So let me come back to an earlier point then. When we talk about a 3-year cycle then for PCI, that assumes obviously a snapshot in time. And clearly what we've heard is that that's not acceptable, that you need to go to some sort of continuous monitoring. Some of the newer requirements, some of the newer regulatory, compliance frameworks, such as FedRAMP, do emphasize continuous monitoring. So is that, in effect, an argument to say that PCI is, I'm going to call it obsolete? I probably just insulted them. Do we need to go to a new standard or framework such as FedRAMP, such as any framework that includes newer requirements like continuous monitoring?
Well, I think just to clarify on that, I believe PCI requires you to continuously comply with all of those controls. The execution, the execution or the implementation of it via QSAs or your consultants doesn't make it feasible for you to continuously comply. Right. So I think the answer is automation, and I want to say about half the controls lend themselves to automation. So if you were to do it, marry compliance and security, right? Then. Yeah.
I've maybe some of your customers are doing that. I haven't run into anybody that has that anywhere close to down, right? The business says wait till the QSA shows up and we'll figure out what we're going to do then. But if you're trying to tell me I need to be prepared for the QSA, well, I'm just not going to deal with it.
Well, and this presents an opportunity, right? This presents an opportunity.
That's always dangerous. Well. It's a problem. No, it's an opportunity.
Well,
there's multiple moving parts when we talk about GRC, right? Because I've been in roles where, as a chief security officer, governance, risk, compliance was under my umbrella. It's not a checkbox. It's all those multiple moving parts within a security organization. It's 24/7, 365 operations. It's fraud. It's alerting. It's policy. It's process. It's procedure. What we're talking about here today from a PCI perspective, that's a process, right? They come in, they do an audit, right? But to be PCI compliant under a GRC umbrella, it includes 24/7, 365 audit me, look at me, change control, assets, inventory, things like that. So it's that whole encompassing package, and I agree with what you said. PCI is point in time. How many people have been, have had breaches that said, but I met compliance. That's why, back to Tim's point too, it's an evolution. It's got to change in some form. We've got to combine compliance with diligence. In real-time diligence, evolution, there is no more point in time. What was 5 minutes ago is no longer now. And I think that's where we really need to get to.
But if you think about really what our customers asking for GRC from the cloud, right? It's really what they're asking for is transparency.
Yeah.
I mean, regardless of what framework they use, the cloud provider may or may not use the same framework, the same standards, the same laws that the customer upholds to. What a cloud provider needs to do is provide that same amount of transparency that customer can then make those GRC type questions and answers for themselves to determine whether that type of data is the correct data that they can put into that cloud service. It's pretty simple.
So does that mean that Google posts on its website the control objectives that it gets audited to under a SAS 70 type?
You're going to disappear.
Stepped right into
we're working on better and better transparency, but we do share, for example, our control objectives of the SAS 70s to customers. The FSMA control objectives, obviously, are NIST 853. Yes. Those are public. Cloud providers that have ISO, those are public. So I think cloud providers need to hear more from their customers, right? What they want to see in terms of compliance requirements and how to present those to their customers. But ultimately, it comes back to, as you said, around the Salesforce, the customer's requirements for the GRC, and based on what kind of data you're putting into that system, whether it's a specific software as a service geared for PCI data or geared for email, or all the way down to an infrastructure as a service, which may have very different types of requirements.
Just to make a quick point here, not to confuse compliance with certification. Right?
Good point.
Certification, point in time.
Please.
You guys are talking a lot about governance and compliance, but I haven't heard much about risk. And I'm interested in what is the relationship between the cloud provider and the enterprise or the organization relative to risk? And who are the people in the organization care the most about risk? What's the definition that you guys use? And can we hear more about that?
Who cares?
Everyone should.
Right? Well, yeah, should. But, I mean, it's I get into those questions and answers a lot with customers, and the business people generally don't unless they need to, I would say. I want to do this. I need to do this in 3 weeks, or I'm not going to get my bonus for executing this in 3 weeks. I don't really care. Give me the piece of paper to sign. I will risk accept anything that comes along, and we will go about our merry way. The security people generally will care about risk if they have time to. More and more we're seeing, as a lot of companies outsource a lot of their continuous monitoring, the people that are left there are generally not the people that necessarily care really deeply about security. They care that they have a job, and they're not really looking to poke their head up and say, hey, don't ship this, because they're just going to get whacked, and away they go. So who cares about risk? Maybe the audit guys do, but they don't really have a lot of power.
Well, I want to say the CFO ultimately cares about risk. Yeah.
If he's aware of it, yeah.
And anything you could do to tie the IT guy ultimately to the business through to some sort of dollar impact for what you're doing is where, that risk starts to resonate with the business. Again, compliance and risk inverse of each other, security and risk inverse of each other. So, there's definitely a strong connection there that can be leveraged to communicate as well as understand impact for what the info security people do.
I think that people care about risk to a degree, but they don't understand the level of risks they may be accepting that could be beyond their means, right? So it's sort of an awareness game, right? And again, maybe some of them are just like, I don't care. Let me know when my CEO goes to jail, right? Then I'll start caring and I'll start looking for another job. But at the end of the day, I think the majority understand that there are risks in anything you do, right? But they don't really understand the impact of said risk. And I think that might be the issue. But then again, that's a security and awareness thing, which there's never any money for that, right?
Sorry, just to follow up on that. I think it's hard to quantify risk in a financial situation as well, because you look at TJ Maxx, they got completely hosed, and did they have any real business impact of that? I mean, their stock price is up.
Stock went up,
doing fine. So it's hard to go to an executive and going look how bad that was for us. And they go, dude, okay, I had to write a check for $100 million. I had to sign up for these consultants for 8 years. But my stock price is up. Why do I care, right? So I think it's a very difficult thing for security people to do, because we talk about the abstract, right? We look at, look what happened to these guys, and then they go talk to...
that's retail, right? Consumers accept that level of risk, because if I look at someone like my mother, she's like, well, I didn't get a letter from TJ Maxx. I'm still going to shop there. I pay cash, right? So you have to look at that variable as well, too. Yeah. But if you're talking about a pharmaceutical company that spits out a drug and people die 2 days after, now that's a different story. I don't think their stock price is going to go through the roof.
Well, and that's why you talk about optimizing, not minimizing your risk, right? You look at your tolerance and the impact and figure out what level of risk you're willing to accept, depending on what business you're in and what data you're talking about.
Yeah, I think as a general field, though, most security people are not good at communicating in general, and then communicating risk specifically to executive staff. And that's where I really see the evolution of the security people in-house, you know, you're going to need fewer and fewer of the guys that are going to read your IDS logs, that are really going to get down in the nitty-gritty, and you really need business-focused people that can evaluate and communicate that risk to an executive level staff. That's the real skill set I see moving forward.